Okay, so 1.1 is Introduction to Cells. So we will learn the basic features of a cell here. Now let's start by talking about the cell theory. What do we know about the cell? Well, first of all, we know that the cell is the basic unit of life. And we know that living organisms are made up of cells. And we have observed that cells can only come from pre-existing cells. And the basic features of a cell is that it has a membrane, it has some sort of genetic material or your DNA that will dictate the activities or features of the cell. It will also have enzymes in the cytoplasm to catalyze different chemical reactions. And we know that the cell needs ATP as a source of energy for all of these metabolic processes. Now, the problem with the cell theory is this. There are many examples in nature that does not seem to follow this general feature of a cell. So in your textbook, you need to know what are the example organisms that challenges what we know about the cell. So these are your muscle cells, your hypha, acetate hypha, and your giant algae. So why do these example challenges our theory about the cell? So let's talk about each one briefly. What we know of the cell is that cells are very small, they're microscopic. However, these muscle cells can be very long, about 30 millimeters right here. At the same time, in one muscle cell, so this whole cylindrical tube, that's one muscle cell, it may contain more than one nucleus. In fact, it is multinucleated. It has lots of nucleuses. So how can that be typical of a cell? Another challenge to the cell theory is your acetate hypha right here. So if you look at the picture, some of your hypha or your hyphae are usually divided into cell-like components. If you look at this picture, it has smaller circular subcomponents, but these are not actually cells. These are like cell-like structures or cell-like sections. However, some hypha, those acetate hypha, if you compare this and this, here as you can see, there's no separation, there's no septum, there's no septa here. So some hyphae can be acetate, no septa, or has those subcellular partitions. So again, the feature, it looks very different from a typical cell. Another one is your giant algae. So most algae are microscopic. However, those giant algae can grow up to the size of, it says 100 millimeters. So how can this one thing be very small at the same time? Some of its species are very large in size. So these three are very atypical of what we know of the cell. So these are examples of challenges to the cell theory. Okay, now let's continue. Now cells make up living organisms, and living organisms can either be unicellular, made up of one cell, or multicellular, so made up of many cells. Examples of unicellular cells are your single-celled prokaryotes or single-celled eukaryotes. So you have here your prokaryotes, remember, there's prokaryote and eukaryotes. You don't have a true nucleus, so these different kinds of bacteria, E. coli, streptococcus, or halobacteria, or it can also be single-celled eukaryotes, such as an amoeba, euglena, paramecium. These are all freshwater organisms, and even some algae. So you have your chlorella, chlamydomonas, the yeast, Saccharomyces. We use this in the lab, the powdery substance. So all of those are single-celled organisms, which means they can exist alone even if they're made up of one cell. Now, is this possible? Because even when they're made up of one cell, they are able to do the following. Mrs. Seagren, they are able to move. They are able to reproduce. They can secrete nutrients. Let's see, Mrs. Seagren. Let's see. They are made up of cells. They can grow. They can respire. They can excrete. They can get food from their environment. So alone, they are still alive. They are still able to show these characteristics of life. Now, as the organism becomes bigger, it is made up of many cells. Now, as an organism, like for example, that organism becomes bigger, the cell doesn't become bigger. What happens is the bigger organisms is made up of still the same size of a cell. Now the question here is, why do cells need to be small? So you have a bigger living organism, why does it need to be made up of smaller cells instead of this whole organism being made up of one cell? So to be able to understand that, you need to learn the concept of surface area and volume. Okay, so let's use a diagram to explain this. All right, so let's use 3 cubes to illustrate this. You have 1 cm cube, and it increases in surface area to 3 cm cube. Now what you can notice here is as the cell size increases, as the cell becomes bigger, obviously the surface area also becomes big, from 6 to 24 to 54. Now, what happens to the volume though? So as you notice, it's from 1 to 8 to 27. So what you can notice here is the surface area increases. This one increases by 3, and then it increases by 2. But the volume increases much faster than the surface area. So from 1, it increased to 8. From 8, it increased to 27. So as you can see, the surface area to volume ratio decreases as the cell size increases. What does that mean? Now, the surface area, you can liken it, or it's like the cell membrane of the cell. And then the volume is the chemical contents or the chemical processes inside the cell, the volume of chemical reaction inside the cell. So what you will learn is, as the cell becomes bigger, there's much more volume than what the surface area can accommodate. Therefore, you will expect that chemical reactions will take place much slower, because you don't have enough surface area or membrane to accommodate for the many chemical processes that needs to move in and out of your cell. Therefore, the cells cannot be big. Cells need to be small. Again, if the cells are bigger, the volume is much more than what the surface area can accommodate. So a simple explanation there is this. If I have, for example, this is my lungs, okay? Compare that to if I only have this one big cell for my lung. If oxygen moves in and it needs to get to this area, it needs to travel a longer distance. It's going to be very slow compared to oxygen is here, and it needs to go to that lower left part of the cell. There, it's right there right away. Another analogy is, if imagine you have a lot of CO2, okay, build up from waste products of your tissue. Now it needs to be exhaled. It needs to go out of your lungs. But there's a lot of CO2, but that cannot pass, all of those CO2 cannot pass through your membrane easily, because you only have this much of a membrane. So you can expect slower diffusion out of CO2. That's the same idea with O2. There's many chemicals inside. There's many volume of chemical processes that are able to be accommodated by this very small membrane. So might as well have this organ made up of many smaller microscopic cells. Okay, so you want a large surface area to volume ratio. You want to have a large surface area so that it can accommodate for the movement of nutrients and waste products in and out of your cells. Okay, now these multicellular organisms, we started from a sperm that united with an egg, resulted into a zygote that underwent several divisions, forming a ball of cells called an embryo. And each cell in an embryo can undergo differentiation. Differentiation from the word differentiate. Differentiation. So to differentiate, meaning all of those one similarly looking cells can start to look different from each other now. And how is this possible? Because cells can express their genes differently. So let's say the cells of your brain is gonna produce different kinds of proteins than the cells of your scalp here. So this is gonna make more of this melanin pigment. So all of the different cells of your body will have the same genes. However, not all of your cells will express the same kinds of genes. Therefore, cells can differentiate. So my analogy here is, I think in class, I said one of my examples were, for example, you have 20 colors in your crayon. So the cells have 20 colors, but different cells will use different shades and different combinations of colors to create a characteristic. So different cells in the body will express their genes that are similar differently. Therefore, you're going to have different looking cells. So skin cells, muscle cells, kidney cells, neurons, they all look different because they express their genes differently. Even though cells look different from each other, when they work together, they produce what you call emergent properties. So these are properties that only emerges or stands out if all of the cells work together. So an example here could be kidney cells. You have different looking cells in the kidney, but then when they're working together, you have that functional filter, that a functional organ that can filter waste products from your blood. So that's what emergent property means. Another analogy here is, for example, if I ask somebody to sing soprano, so you have those really high notes, doesn't make sense. If I ask somebody to sing bass, you have those really low notes. However, if I ask everyone, soprano, alto, bass, tenor, to sing together, you can create a harmony. So that's the same idea with our cells. Our cells are very, very small. It looks like they're isolated from each other, but if they work together, they can form a functional organ. If all the organs work together, they can form a functional body system. Okay, that is what you call an emergent property. Now, I have 2 minutes to discuss what stem cells are. So let me insert here the whole point of differentiation. It will lead us into our topic of stem cells. I'll leave this to you to review. What are stem cells? These are stem cells that are both totipotent and pluripotent, which basically means it can keep dividing and it can keep differentiating into the different cells of the body. And there's 3 kinds of stem cells in your textbook. So you have the adult stem cells, you have the embryonic stem cells, the most controversial of them all, and you have the cord blood stem cells. So these are stem cells from the umbilical cord. So for the test, make sure you can discuss the use and ethical issues of each of these stem cells.